Hi guys, we're here to talk about soil formation, and we're going to start out with the idea of weathering. So I will share a screen so that we can look at some photographs together to help us understand this concept. Okay, so when we think about weathering, we start out with this idea of parent material. So parent material is the name that we give to rock, which forms soil. So in this picture here, we have rocky material underneath, and then you can see that there's soil that's stacked on top of this rocky material. And you may have not considered very much before as to how this soil got stacked on top of this rocky material. And the answer to that question is that the rocky material actually broke down to form the soil. And so the soil is predominantly made up of these mineral fragments that make up rocks. And then of course they're mixed in with air and water and organic matter to form soil. But soil scientists use this term parent material to describe the rock that is the parent of the soil. And so the rock can either be originated on site, so it could be some big body of rock, like a big granite dome or something that has been there for a very long time. Or it could be rocky material that has been transported into the site. So sometimes we might see this along like river channels where we have a bunch of rocky boulders and material that's being moved down through the river system. And when that material is deposited, it can form a parent material in the place where it kind of got dropped off by the river, even though that's not the place where those rocks originally came from. So in either case, we consider those parent materials. In either case, they can break down over time to form soil. And then, as I already said, they combine with organisms that live and move through the soil. They combine with organic matter from dead and dying organisms, and then they combine with air and water. I don't have that listed on the slide, to form the soil that we know of on the Earth's surface. So when we think about what this parent material is made of, as I mentioned before, rocks are made up of a combination of minerals. So that may be a term you've heard of before, or maybe not. So let's just quickly define that minerals are things that are solid, they're naturally occurring, they're inorganic, meaning they're not part of a living organism. They're not made of that structure of carbon-hydrogen bonds. They don't come from organisms with DNA and whatnot. So they're inorganic. And then two other important characteristics about them is that they have this very orderly internal structure of the way that the different atoms inside the minerals are put together. And so they have these really regular patterns. And one of the most common minerals that forms many rocks on our Earth's surface is kind of the silicate structure that it has silicon atoms surrounded by oxygen atoms in what's called a tetrahedral shape, this kind of three-sided pyramid shape. And then many of these three-sided pyramids link all together to form quartz. And then there's different variations on the theme where certain oxygens are replaced with things like aluminum and things like calcium and things like magnesium and things like iron that form different minerals and different rocks. And so those materials are what originally make up the rocks, and then those are the materials that break down to form the soil. And what we have in the original rocks and minerals to start out with is going to have a big impact on the soil. It's going to impact how easily the rocks can break down. And it's also going to impact the composition of the soil. If we have minerals inside rocks of parent material that have lots of iron, say, then we will have a soil that's rich in iron. Whereas if we have rocks in parent material that are filled with calcium and no magnesium, then we might have certain kinds of nutrients that are available in the soil, and then we may have others that are more deficient in the soil. And that is kind of tied back to the original structure of the parent material. So as I already said, this kind of structure that I have shown here as a quartz, which is this combination of silicon and oxygen, is kind of the most common type of structure. And I said there's variations on the theme where we might have aluminum or magnesium or sulfur, other things mixed in. But all the minerals that form this kind of from this basic structure are called silicate minerals, and they are kind of the most common types of minerals that we have on our Earth's surface. And then they, of course, vary depending on exactly what they're composed of. Some are lighter in color. Things like quartz, you probably can imagine as like a pretty white color. And that is usually indicative of a stronger set of bonds within the mineral. So those light materials don't break down as easily in the presence of wind and water, as we'll talk about next. Whereas the kind of deep, darker colored minerals that are created because of more metal inside them are usually more susceptible to being broken down. And so if you think about going to like a beach, say, which is kind of the remnants of a bunch of rocky material that has been washed down a big river system all the way from the mountains, usually in most cases, the majority of the material at the beach is this kind of lighter colored quartz and other minerals like feldspar. And that's because those minerals are a little bit more or stronger at the conditions at the Earth's surface. So anyway, what the structure of the rocks, basically, the point is going to influence how they break down, and it's also going to influence the composition of some sort of soil that eventually forms from them and what kinds of nutrients might be available. Okay, so the rocks break down through a process that's called weathering. So this is just basically the breakdown of rocks over time due to the interactions with the atmosphere. So this ATM, little abbreviation I have here, is atmospheric interaction. And so that might be with wind, that might be with water in the atmosphere, that might just be with different kinds of gases and chemicals in the atmosphere. And the weathering process is often broken down into two kind of subcategories. And the first one is called sometimes physical and also sometimes mechanical weathering. So those two terms, physical and mechanical, are synonyms, are interchangeable terms for the same process that describes the breakdown of rocks due to kind of physical force. So if something kind of smashes the rock or pushes on the rock, usually from the outside, that breaks it apart, then that is a physical or mechanical weathering process. And so over here on the bottom right, I have a picture of a granite boulder up in the mountains, and it is being cracked over time by ice. So little drops of water get down and very small cracks in the rock, and that ice freezes up. And as you might know from your experience with ice in the past, when water freezes, it actually expands. And then that expanding ice can actually kind of wedge and crack the boulders apart through this physical force. So that's a kind of freeze thaw cracking process. That would be an example of physical or mechanical weathering. On the other hand, we have a set of processes that we refer to as chemical weathering. And these are basically just more microscopic processes. Chemical reactions are forces that are occurring on a microscopic level. But in this case, we have different kinds of chemical reactions that are actually happening on the surface of the rocks as it interacts with water, air, different kinds of biological exudates. So, you know, like a lichen is growing on the rock, it might be exuding different kinds of chemicals that are breaking the rock down. And so we can have rocks that are kind of being eaten away as the surface materials of the rock are reacting in these different kinds of chemical reactions. So this picture on the left is showing sandstone that's essentially being dissolved. The little pieces of cement that are holding the different sand grains together are being kind of reacting with the water, or interacting with the water, I should say, and are essentially being washed away. So that would be an example of a chemical weathering process. So just to give a little bit more detail about what these two processes might look like, physical weathering can have many different forms. So I kind of already mentioned the freeze thaw cycle that can happen, and I have a picture down at the bottom left of the slide here that shows water getting into a crack and then that water expanding as it freezes and pushing the rock farther apart to expand that kind of fracture. But there's many other ways that physical weathering can happen as well. So one process in geology is called jointing, and jointing is basically the formation of cracks in rock over time. And in many cases, these joints are not necessarily occurring because of a very specifically located force, but just because of kind of an expansion or contraction of the whole rock body as it changes its pressure and temperature environment from where it formed. So if you had a big mass of granite that was deep under the earth, underneath a volcano, which is where those originally formed, and then all of a sudden it was exposed, or it wouldn't be all of a sudden, but 50 million years later, the surface of the earth eroded away and exposed that big granite piece. Now the conditions at the surface are under much less pressure than the granite was when it was deep down, and so the whole granite body kind of expands and can crack apart through that expansion. So that would be an example of jointing. Or sometimes like volcanic rocks that are very hot when they first form will shrink up a little bit as they cool down, and they can crack as a result of that. So that could be a physical and chemical, or sorry, that could be a kind of mechanical weathering process as well. And we call those types of fractures and rocks joints in particular. So as I just already explained, that could be a result of thermal and pressure changes due to expansion and contraction. And this isn't usually thermal temperature changes like throughout the day on the Earth's surface, not like, well, it was freezing last night and now it's 50 degrees. That kind of temperature is not going to be enough to expand and contract a rock. But if we had a temperature that was extremely hot underneath the earth, and now we're exposed to the earth where it's much, much, much colder, like several hundred degrees Celsius colder, then we might have that kind of expansion or contraction or pressure change jointing. At the earth's surface, we are much more likely to have these kinds of wedging processes that I described with the water and the ice. And this could also happen as a result of plant roots. So a tiny little plant root could kind of work its way into a little crack in the rock. And then over decades or centuries, the root of that plant could start to grow and grow and grow and act like a wedge, just like that ice did, to push the rock farther and farther apart and open up that crack. So you've probably seen things like trees growing out of the side of rocks in very impressive ways. Or you've maybe seen trees kind of eating through human structures like sidewalks, or this particular kind of ancient structure that's in Cambodia in an area called Angkor Wat. So these kinds of processes can create this mechanical weathering as well. And then of course, a final category would be like abrasion, where we basically just have rocks that are kind of rubbing up against each other. So if you can imagine, a rock falls off a cliff and then smashes into a bunch of other rocks on the way down, or rocks are being tumbled through a river system. Those kinds of kind of just collisions that occur could fracture both the hitting rock and the rock that gets hit as well, and lead to the breakdown. And when you have billions of years or millions of years to wait around, this can really break down a lot of rock to build a lot of soil material. Okay, on the other hand, chemical weathering is kind of, as we said, these different kinds of chemical reaction processes that occur along the surface of the rock. And so these are sometimes referred to as biogeochemical processes. So these reactions that are kind of a combination between organic material, just different kinds of chemicals in the environment, and then of course occurring on the surface of rock. So that's the geo part. So this might occur as a result of different kinds of microorganisms that are living on the surface of rocks, and they're exuding different kinds of chemicals or acids that are breaking down rock. Lichen, which is shown growing a lot on this rock on the right-hand side, is a really common, what we call pioneer species, that comes into newly exposed rock and grows on the rock surface, and is kind of in a process that we call primary succession, where the lichen really starts to form the first layer of soil in that environment. So that's why it's called primary. And basically the lichen similarly exudes different kinds of acids. Those acids break down a little bit of rock. The lichen also decomposes as it dies and mixes with air and water and creates these little tiny pockets of soil on the surface of the rock, and then grass can start to grow in those little pockets, and then grass roots can start to wedge the rock apart and break it down farther. And again, over time, if we're patient, we'll see that soil is being built in these locations where this chemical weathering is happening. Other common forms of chemical weathering would be dissolution, which is basically a fancy term for dissolving. So we know that water is pretty good at dissolving different kinds of minerals like salt. I'm sure are aware that salt can dissolve in water. And so salt, which is in geology called halite, and many other kinds of minerals exist within rocks. And so as the water is washing across these rocks over time, or things like calcite is another common mineral, those things can actually just literally dissolve in water. And so they can be kind of removed from the surface of the rock over time. And then another common process that you've likely observed before is oxidation. So oxidation is when it was actually a broader process, but in geology, most commonly what we see is oxygen reacting with different kinds of compounds on the surface. And we notably see this when oxygen reacts with iron on the surface. That creates that rusty red color that we see in rust, and then we see in soil. When we see dark red soils, they're essentially just rusted pieces of old mineral, giving them that red color. This picture down here is a calcite type structure, which is a type of mineral that has calcium, sulfur, and other things in it. No, sorry, calcium and carbon and oxygen in it. And it is essentially being dissolved by its presence in the air, and then or in the rainwater, and that is being accelerated by the fact that there's probably some acidity in the rain water as well. Okay, so I think that's a good place for us to stop.